Then last week we looked at the victory of suffering, where we saw the answer to the question, how do I know that God is going to make it right one day? We want to have certainty of that. If we're going to stake our life on it, if we're going to be willing to endure the things that come from following Jesus, then I want to be certain, I want to be sure that God is going to make it right one day. And so last week we looked at the victory of suffering, that God in Jesus defeated all of his enemies, that he defeated the enemy of sin on the cross, he defeated the enemy of death in the resurrection, and that he put all of his enemies, Satan, the demonic powers in the spiritual realm, all of that is subjected to Jesus Christ as he ascends into heaven and takes his seat at the right hand of God to rule and reign from on high. So the victory that God won in Jesus 2,000 years ago is the reason why we can be sure that God's going to make it right again one day. And all of those are great things. That's glorious truth for us to rejoice in. But the question next is, what now? What do we do now? And so in 1 Peter verse 1 here in chapter 4, Peter said, since therefore, what did we just talk about? Victory. Since therefore, Christ suffered in the flesh. So what he's about to tell us is, this is what's next. This is what we do after the victory. This is how we live in the victory. All right? Because there's some measure of time between the victory Christ achieved in his death, burial, and resurrection and the consummation or glorification or the end of all things. There's a bit of time in between there. And so this is what we're looking at. What do we do in that in-between time while we wait on Jesus to come back? And so if you have your Bible open, Peter's going to start into this today. And we'll start there in verse 1. The Bible says, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they're surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached, even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies. In order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. If you go back to verse 2, he said, so as, look at this, as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh. What I want to talk about this morning is what you do with the rest of your time. What do you do with the rest of your time? If you look at this passage, you'll see time is an important part of the passage. You have what I'm basing this message on there in verse 2, the rest of your time. Then in verse 3, if you look, it says the time that is past. All right, so you have what I have ahead of me now in this life. I have the time that was past in this life. And all of that leads up to what he said in verse 7, where he said, the end of all things is at hand. Now, did Peter write this book yesterday? Did Peter write this letter this year? Did Peter write this century or the last century or any time in the last millennium? No. Peter wrote this 2,000 years ago, essentially. And so the question is, was Peter mistaken about that? He said, the end of all things is at hand. Did Peter get that wrong? Was he just confused? Was he mistaken? Did he miss it? No, I would say, no, he did not miss anything here. That they, in his day, they were in the last days. 2,000 years ago was the last days, and we're still in the last days now. The last days are, I've said this many times before, but the last days are the time in between Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, what we looked at last week, and then the time when Jesus comes back. And so the next big event on the timeline of redemption, the next big event is the return of Jesus Christ. And so when he says the end is at hand, what he's actually telling us is that the return of Jesus Christ is imminent. That's what he said. Now, when you hear the word imminent, you may think, all right, like now. That means now, right? If it's imminent, that means it's going to happen today even maybe. But imminent doesn't mean that it's going to happen today, but it does mean that it could happen today. How many of you believe Jesus could come back today? Right. He could. Don't be waiting for little, world things to fall into place or whatever you might be looking for or whatever. Just understand, the way the New Testament puts it, Jesus could come back anytime. It could be today. It could be tomorrow. It could be any day or hour. But however long it is, this is the bottom line on this, however long it is, all of us have a limited amount of time in this life. That's it. There's a limited amount of time that we have in this life. Whether Christ comes back in our lifetime or whether we live until we die, all of our time is limited. And so the Bible teaches us that what we do in that limited time that God has given us in this life has an impact on what happens after this life. What we do in the limited time we have in this life has an impact on the next life. And so if the time we have is limited and what we do in this life matters beyond this life, then the challenge that all of us have as believers is to make the time that we have count. I listened to one pastor, the way he put it, he said, are you counting time? Or are you making the time count? That's a good question. Which one are you doing? Are you just counting time? Or are you making the time count? And the same pastor, he said, there's two ways we can use our time. I thought this was helpful way to look at it. There's two ways that we can use our time. We can spend our time or we can invest our time. That's it. You can spend it or you can invest it. Spend it or invest it. And it's a lot like money. In fact, money's probably the easier way to think about it. So when I spend my money, what happens to it? When I spend it, I lose it, right? It's gone. It goes out. It's not coming back. And typically the things that I'm going to spend my money on, those are going to be things that meet my short-term needs. That's what most of us spend our money on. Things that meet our short-term or mid-term needs. Like I buy food with my money. I spend my money on bills that I have to pay. I spend my money on activities that I want to do to have fun or recreation or whatever. And then I take that and I eat the food, and then guess what? When I eat the food, the money's gone and the food's gone. And I have to spend more money to get more food. I pay my bills with that money. And that's great. I'm all clear this month. But those bills are coming back again next month, right? So I spend my money on the bills. I got to turn around. I got to do it again next month. I spend my money, I go, to the movies, and I entertain myself for a couple of hours, kind of a nice diversion for a couple of hours, and then the movie's over, and I'm back in my real life again. And so I spend it, and it's gone. But investments are completely different, right? It's different. When I invest something, I'm not losing it. I'm giving it a chance to grow into something bigger. Right? Something that doesn't just meet my short-term needs, but that has a chance to meet a longer-term need that I have and have a chance to make a more lasting impact in life or in the world. But in order for me to do that, in order for all of us to invest anything, then that means, listen to me, that means we have to defer what I can do now so that I can do more later. That's what it means when you invest. I defer what I want to do now so that I can do more later. It's just like my retirement account or your retirement account. I have money every single month that is put into my retirement account. It is invested in whatever it is that it's invested in, my mutual fund. I really don't even know what it goes into, but it goes into that mutual fund for an investment purpose. And that is money that I really could use right now to meet some immediate needs in my life. Or maybe not even needs, Gus. Maybe just to buy that gun I've been looking for, right? So I can use it. I could use it for that. That's money I could easily use for something like that. But I don't get to use it that way. I could, But I'm choosing not to. When I make an investment, I am choosing not to use that to pay my bills. I'm choosing not to use that to buy food. I'm choosing not to use that to go on vacation or to buy my wife a necklace or to buy, that gun that I want. But it is still going out every single month in the same way as if I were spending it, but I'm not spending it. I'm not losing it. It's going out, but it's going out in order to be built up. So I'm deferring what I can do now with my money for something more that I can do later. And it's the exact same thing with our time. You can spend your time or you can invest it. That every second that goes by in your life, every day that goes by in your life, is an opportunity for you to send it out. The time that you have, the use of the time that you have, to send it out for short-term gain, whatever that might be. Look, I'm not bashing that. We have to do it, right? Whatever it might be. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but every second that you spend could be sent out for that short-term gain, or it can be invested to build up for the long term. Now, when I say long term, in this life, what we're thinking is, after I retire or somewhere in that vicinity. I'm investing so that when I turn, I don't know what it'll be for me, maybe 70, good for, I don't know, what is that, 40, 24 years. Pretty bad at math. Maybe in 24 years, my investments will have grown to the point where I can live off of it for the rest of my, 35 years on earth until I turn 105. That's Brooke and I's informal agreement. We're shooting for about 100 to 105. So when I say long term, I'm not talking about, though, in this life. I'm talking about the time after this life. That's the long term we're investing for, the time after. And so again, comes back to this again. What I do in this life is either spend my time for this life or I invest my time for eternity. All right? And I already said, of course, we have to do both. You got to eat. You can't go, I'm not going to eat because I'm too busy sharing the gospel. No, we have to eat. We have to pay our bills because we don't want to get evicted. We don't want our power turned off. And, it's okay to do some activities. You want to go have fun. That's okay to do that. So we have to do those things. But the point is, what we're looking at is the balance. We have to keep that eternity in our mind always. That needs to color the way that we even spend our time, that we keep eternity in the back of our minds for the rest of our days in the flesh, because there is a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. If time is limited, then when I put time into one thing, then I'm by definition taking time that I could be spending doing something else. So as I spend my time, I'm taking time away from where I could be investing my time. There's that trade-off. So we're trying to find that balance. We're trying to tilt the balance. And I think Peter would say to us, I think the Lord would say to us this morning is that probably for all of us, we probably all need to be spending less and investing more. And again, I'm not talking about money, but you could apply it to that too. We need to be spending less and investing more of our time. Tilt that balance towards more investing. And so I want to look the next 2 weeks, I want to look at 3 ways to make the most, to make the rest of the time count. 3 ways to make the rest of your time count. Number 1, we invest in God's will. Invest in God's will. If you look again at verse 1, Peter said, "Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." So the first thing I want to point out here is you need to understand that even though that war has already won, we're living in the victory, that there are still battles to be fought. It's just like, after the Civil War, it took a while to get word to some of the other territories out a little further west that the war is actually over. And so battles were still fought, even though the war had already been completed, correct? So even though Jesus has already won the victory that happened 2,000 years ago, we're living in the victory now. There's still battles left to fight. So he said, arm yourself. That is a military term. It would have been used to talk about soldiers preparing for battle, preparing to go out to meet the enemy. And so arm yourself would have been, hey, it's time. Get your armor on, get your weapon ready. We're going out to face the enemy. And so Peter is applying that to our life now, saying, arm yourself. Be ready to face the enemy. Who is the enemy? What I would say to you in this passage, the enemy is the person you see in the mirror. That's where you find the enemy that we're dealing with right here. Because the battlefield, the battle that we're fighting right now, is an internal battle between who I used to be and who I am now. That's the battle. It's a battle between who I used to be and who I am right now. I said this a couple of months ago. The greatest battle that most of us are ever going to have to fight is the battle between our old self and our new self. And this is not a battle with weapons, it's a battle of wills. That's what we see here. So the person you used to be before you met Christ is battling with the person that you are now in Jesus for the control of your life. Right? We talked about that back in January. Right? You feel that battle. We feel it every day. My life is a battlefield between the old me and the new me. So if you notice how he put it in 2 and 3, he said, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh. That just means until you die. Right? The rest of the time in the flesh just means the rest of your human life here on earth. No longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. All right? So there's the battle right there. You want to boil the battle down, it's my want versus God's will. All right? My want versus God's will. And then he goes on and he tells us in 3, where your passions want to take you. If I follow my wants, what my old self wants, if I follow as far as I can take it, this is where it wants to take me. And it's a little bit graphic. So if you look again at the rest of verse 3, and so this is what the Gentiles want to do. When he says Gentiles, he doesn't really mean anything about ethnicity here. He just means people that don't know God. That's essentially what he's saying. The time is past to do what people that don't know God want to do, which is, he said, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. So if you take those and you just boil them all down, he could have said a lot of different things here, but if you boil the things down that he did say, this is all about unrestrained and uncontrolled living. That's what these things indicate. It's a life that's unrestrained and uncontrolled. That your flesh is always trying to get you to take off all of the restraints that you have to fulfilling whatever it is that your most base desire. And that's what this list is. These are unrestrained desires that you fulfill. It's unrestrained sexual immorality and sensuality. It's unrestrained drunkenness and drunken parties. Those are what all these refer to. It's drunken parties, unrestrained sexuality, sensuality, fulfilling all of the passions of your flesh. That's what this is. Now, why does the old you want you to be unrestrained? Why is it trying to get you to take the restraints off and fulfill whatever it is that you desire to do? Well, here's what it will tell you. It will say to you, so you can be happy. Don't you want to be happy? Don't you want to be fulfilled? Don't you want to experience all the pleasure that this life has to offer? Don't you want to numb your pain? Don't you want to deal with your pain? Don't you want to deal with your boredom? Don't you want to have a good time? And more than that, look, it'll tell you, you deserve it. Man, you deserve this. You work so hard. You want to be able to play hard. You want to blow off steam. You want to enjoy yourself. Whatever it is that your flesh tells you. But what I want you to know this morning is it's all a lie. The things that your flesh is trying to say to you is a lie. The point is to get you out of control. It wants you unrestrained so that you can lose control. And why do you think your flesh would want you to lose control? Why? Here you go. To keep you out of the fight. Why does your flesh want you unrestrained? So you can be out of control. Why does your flesh want you to lose control? So that it will take you out of the fight. If you've ever been drunk before, how easy is it for you to walk straight? You can't walk straight when you're drunk. You can't fight for righteousness when your senses are dull, when you're controlled by your base desires. No, instead, your thinking is going to be foggy, it's going to be cloudy, you're going to make bad decisions, you're going to set bad examples, and what ultimately is going to happen in your life, some of you know this from experience, what ultimately is going to happen in your life is you're going to be on a never-ending roller coaster of pleasure in the moment, followed by shame and regret in the morning. That's what it looks like. It's pleasure in the moment and pain in the morning. And Peter said, that is not the way we live. Not our new self. Not the us in Christ. He said, the time is past. The time that you spent before, that was more than enough time to do all of that. He's saying, that was then. That was old you. That was dead you. Before you knew Christ. But that old you, if you're a believer this morning, that old you, even if you listen to your flesh from time to time, that old you, it's dead. That old you is buried in the grave. We saw that last week. God put your old self in the grave with Christ. And now you're alive in Jesus. Now you're full of the Spirit. And so that means you need to stay in the fight. Even though the battle is over, walking in victory in this time in our lives, the rest of the time in the flesh, walking in victory means staying in the fight and being self-controlled and sober-minded. That's what he says in verse 7. So therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded. Not unrestrained, not out of control, but self-controlled, sober-minded. And so if I'm going to stay in the fight, Peter says here, I have to arm myself with the same way of thinking that Christ had. That's my concealed carry weapon against the flesh. My concealed carry weapon against my flesh, my old self, it's right here. It's my mind. It's my mindset. That thing you can't see into. It's that I think like Jesus thinks. I see the world like Jesus sees the world. And practically what that means right here is it means that I am resolved to do. Listen to me here. I'm resolved. This is what I'm arming myself with. When it says arm yourself with the same way of thinking that Jesus did, it's a resolve to do God's will no matter what it costs. That's the bottom line. That I would be so invested in God's will that I would follow it no matter what it costs. And that's what Jesus did. That's why it's Jesus' mindset. He does this. He follows the will of the Father wherever it might be leading him. Even to suffering, even to the death on the cross. But, here's the glory, in doing that, in following his Father's will, not his own wants, because as a human, the Bible says Jesus was tempted in every way like unto us. So he was tempted. Do you think Jesus was tempted maybe a time or two to avoid the suffering that could have come into his life? Maybe. I mean, he prayed, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But he did it anyway. He followed it even to death. And in doing that, what Jesus did was disarm sin. He broke the power of sin in his life because, listen to me here, if sin, if flesh, if your old self, if it cannot tempt you any longer with pleasure, and if it cannot intimidate you anymore with threats of suffering and pain, then its power is broken. And so when you decide that you're going to resolve yourself to follow the will of God no matter where it leads, even if it leads to your suffering, even if it leads to your death, even if it leads to you becoming an outcast, being mocked, being cast out, then you are breaking the power that sin has over you because you are saying to sin, you are saying to your old self, you can no longer intimidate me with suffering because I am resolved in my heart and mind that I'm following the will of God wherever it leads. That's what he means here when he said, whoever suffers has ceased from sin. If you suffered, you know you still sin. But the point is, you have ceased from being under the control and ruling power of sin in Christ. If I am willing to suffer, then sin's power is being broken in my life. And that is an investment, but not spending. It's an investment versus spending. So he said, you spent. Look at your life. Do you feel this in your life? You spent more than enough time The time that is past, he said, suffices for living your life your way. Is that true in your life? Have you come to that place where you can look and go, I want to look back on that time. I don't want to live in it anymore. The time that's past. You saw where it led. You saw that was the path to shame. You saw that was the path to regret. You saw that was the path to pain. You saw that was the path to restlessness and despair and hangover and frustration and for short-term pleasure instead of long-term gain. And so in your life, are you ready to say, for the rest of the time that I have, I'm going to invest in the will of God, that I'm going to be willing to defer my short-term pleasure for long-term gain? Is that where you're at this morning? What are you living for? Number 2. I got a little ways to go, man. It sounded like a wrap up, but if we're rolling up on 9 o'clock and you look and go, wow, we still got 15 minutes left. He's finishing short. Don't believe it. Don't believe it. It will never be. It will never be. It will never be. Just a minute more. Invest, number 2, invest. Invest in evangelism. Quite honestly, I'm embarrassed with the wording of that point. I think there's probably a much better way I could have put it than that, but this is the simplest way to capture what I think this next part means. And so what Peter does here is he starts with the way that a lost person, not every time, but the way that a lost person often responds when they see that you're no longer living like they do. When they see that you don't do the things that they do and think the way that they think and speak the way that they speak. So if you look at verse 4, Peter said, with respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery. That word debauchery just means an excessive indulgence in sensual pleasures. That's what he just talked about in verse 3, an excessive indulgence in sensual pleasures. And so the first response that you see there, the first response is surprise. They're surprised. When they see you don't join them in that anymore, they're surprised. Now, why are they surprised by that? Why would they be surprised by that? Here's why. They're surprised because they don't understand us. Warren Wiersbe said, unsaved people do not understand the radical change that their friends experience when they trust Christ and become children of God. They do not think it strange, listen to this, they do not think it strange when people wreck their bodies, destroy their homes, and ruin their lives by running from one sin to another. But let a drunkard become sober or an immoral person pure, and the family thinks he's lost his mind. That's it, isn't it? People can wreck their lives with sin, but we're the crazy ones. That's a little off, isn't it? I thought, we can see that so clearly, but why can't they see it? Here's why they can't see it. Here's why they don't understand. It's this, because all they can see is now. That's why it doesn't make sense. All they can see is now. All they have to live for is now. That they have no investment in eternity. They have no investment in the future, just now. They have nothing to look forward to. Maybe they have things to look forward to in this life. They have nothing to look forward to after this life. And so they don't understand what we're living for because they've never been where we are. They don't have the same hope that we have. They don't have the same inheritance to look forward to one day. And so he says they're surprised when we don't join them. And I like that flood of debauchery, especially after we talked about the flood last week. That's literally what the word means, it's like a flood of sensual pleasure. They're surprised we don't join them. Man, it seems like it'd be so fun. Why wouldn't you join us here? Seems like it'd be such pleasure, such fulfillment, such happiness. So surprise. Second response is they malign. Now, this is not new for us. We've looked at this several times through this series, but just want to remind you that this is the type of persecution they were facing. When we think about persecution in the New Testament times, our minds usually are drawn to what actually happened later on in the Roman Empire. Not so much in the earliest days was there official, like state-sponsored persecution. So this is not feeding them to the lions and things like that. This is what it was at this time. It was maligning. It was slandering. It was speaking evil of them. It was calling them, listen to this and listen to this, calling them haters of humanity. They said Christians are haters. They're filled with hate. They literally said that. Does that sound familiar with you right now? The idea being, if you don't join us in the way we think, if you don't join us in what we do, then the only reason could be is that you're a hater, that you hate. You're filled with hate and not love. That is where our discourse is in our society today. That's the discourse of the world around us. You will hear that same thing over and over again. Oh, you don't want to join us Christians in Pride Month. You don't want to celebrate Pride Month with us. You don't want to join us at the library for Drag Queen Story Hour. You don't want to live with your boyfriend or girlfriend before you get married. You don't believe in abortion. Why are you so hateful? That's the idea, right? Christians are haters. They're haters. But they don't get that it's not hate. It's that we know what's coming next. We don't hate them. We know what's coming. Verse 5 says, "But they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." Let me sum this up like this. They're going to die one day. We all will, but they're going to die one day. And when that day comes, they will not be ready for what's coming. But this text says God will be ready. It said God is ready now, and not to receive them, but to judge. That's what Peter said. A God who is ready to judge the living and the dead. And that is a terrifying thought. That one day, a person in their sinfulness, uncovered by the blood of Jesus, might have to stand before a perfectly righteous, holy, sinless God and then give an account of their life. What kind of account is this going to be? It's an account for how you lived, how you thought, what you did, how you used your time. Most importantly, it'll be an account of how you responded to the gospel. How did you respond to Jesus? And at that time, you understand it'll be too late, right? By that point, it's too late. Simple way to remember. If you wait, it's too late. I was very proud of myself for that. If you wait, it's too late. And we don't like to talk about that. We don't like to think about that. But when they stand before the judge, guess what the judge will do? The judge will condemn and sentence. And the only way to escape that judgment is faith in Christ. And the only time for that is now, not then. And so when I say what we do in this life impacts eternity, that's really what I'm talking about. And you know this, but you need to feel this. You only get one chance, and this life is the chance, because after this life is over, there is no second chance. And so what Peter says here about them is incredible. He doesn't say, remember, he's trying to encourage us, but look what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, so don't worry, those people are going to get what's coming to them. That's not the punchline here. That's not the application here. Don't worry, they're going to get what's coming to them. That's true, but it's not what he says, is it? What does he say instead? He said, this is why we preach the gospel. That blows me away. This is the takeaway here for people enduring maligning, suffering, whatever, at the hands of evil people that do not know Jesus, do not love Jesus, and don't love me because I follow Jesus. This is the takeaway. He said, this is why we preach the gospel. Look at verse 6. He said, for this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, that just means they died, they might live in the spirit the way God does. That means that after they die, they still live. He said, that's why we do this. That's why we do what we do. That's why we're on this mission to begin with, so that we can proclaim that truth to people, that one day, it doesn't mean you preach to dead people. We are not going and having a service in the cemetery so they can hear it one more time, get one more chance. That's not the point. It's that I preached to them while they still were alive, while they still had a chance. Because after this life is over, that's the only chance you're going to get. And so what it means is there's an urgency to the mission. Now I'm wrapping up. There's an urgency. I wonder, do you feel the urgency of the mission? Do you feel the urgency for your life? Maybe you hear this, you go, I'm in the category of people that will stand and face judgment and condemnation. I recognize in my life right now, I don't know Christ. I've never trusted Christ. I've never put my faith in Him. I've never put my life in His hands. Do you sense the urgency in this now? Time is short. Do you believe that? If you got 70 more years, time is short. Do you feel the urgency in your life? If you do, if the Lord's speaking to your heart this morning, if He's saying to you, today's the day for you, today's the day of salvation for you, then you need to respond by giving your heart and your life to Jesus today. Do you feel the urgency for people in your life that don't know Christ? That's the application for us. Look at this. How do I invest my time? Listen, every second you invest in evangelizing the lost, in preaching, proclaiming, sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, every second is a possible investment in eternity. It might be a crown for you, but it's life for that person that receives it. Who in your life are you feeling that urgency for right now? Who you've been praying for? You got somebody in your life? Do you have a family member? Do you have a neighbor? Do you have a friend? Do you have a coworker? Do you have somebody in your life? They may live in the home with you. Somebody that you know will one day give an account to God, be judged and condemned because they are apart from Christ. Who do you have that urgency for today? You go, I really wish somebody would share it. Let me suggest you might be the somebody. Maybe God's using you to get to them. They don't understand why you live how you live. They're surprised. They might not like it. They might think you're crazy. Maybe you would have thought the same thing before you knew Jesus. Who are you praying for? Time is short. What we do in this life, it matters. Not just in this life, but it matters forever. How are you using your time? What's the balance for you? When you look at it, is it all just spent? Some of it wasted? Or are you investing in forever?